Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our VMware on VMware webinar. This webinar will be recorded. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. All lines have been muted to prevent any background noise. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. Our speaker will answer your questions as time permits. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn the time over to our presenter. Michelle, you may begin.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. And my name is Michelle McNeil. I have been at VMware since 2006. So back in the early days when we were under 1,500 employees, we now have a workforce of over 30,000 globally. So today, I'm going to take you through how we were able to shift our workforce to remote on a very, very rapid scale. In some cases, like India, we had very, very little advance notification in terms of the lockdowns and shelter in place. So let me start off with doing a quick summary of our current situation at VMware and how we were able to shift our global workforce to work remotely. First of all, back in January, we invoked our crisis management team. I initially established the crisis management team back in 2016, and even though in January the situation did not quite meet our threshold, it wasn't yet declared a pandemic, we were monitoring the situation. We knew there was a lot of concern in China, and so we quickly put that team into action where we convened and started monitoring the situation and addressing how we were going to be able to mitigate the risk. Of course, as everybody is aware, we've all been impacted on a personal and professional scale. This is something that regardless of how much planning you do, no one ever really quite anticipates this type of health threat. But I think we were able to mobilize quickly and respond to the situation. At this point in time, we have close to 98% of our workforce working remotely. We have just a very, very small list of people who are identified as essential workers, people who work in maybe the data center, physical security, facility staff, who actually are able to go into the building. But 97% of our workforce is now working from home. And we're finding that our productivity metrics are showing that that has been a pretty seamless transition. How did we go about doing that? Well, first, we allow an employee who no longer has access to a building 3 options. The first option is they can just use their existing work device. If they have a laptop that's been issued to them and they have it in their possession, then they can just log in from home. We also support any personal device. So if for some reason somebody did not have a laptop or had left it in the office, we can enable them to use a personal device. Or a really awesome feature is that we have vending machines at our tier 1 sites where people can actually badge in if they have access to the building and check out a laptop from our vending machine on campus. One of the things that we're able to do is leverage our technology. So many of you are probably familiar with or heard of Workspace ONE. That's our digital workspace platform, and it allows people to securely access our corporate systems, whether it's email, any of the internal systems that they have to have access to do their work. We also have VMware Tunnel, which provides a seamless VPN-like connection to our internal websites. We also have VMware Horizon, which actually mimics Windows, and you do not need a laptop to be able to leverage that. And then finally, we have our no-touch laptop provisioning. So we don't actually need IT to set up the machines for people to be able to access the corporate systems. Going back to our current situation, our guiding principles have been first and foremost, making sure that our colleagues' health and safety is always top of mind in all our discussions. We do not want to rush back to a return to office scenario if we don't think that the situation is safe enough to do so. We also find that the communications are probably one of the most essential frameworks that we need to be successful at managing this crisis. I will go into a little bit more detail further along, but again, I would say a really, really strong foundation is having a strong communications framework to make sure that employees are getting timely information, and we have FAQs, and also if they want to submit any specific questions that have not been addressed, we have a team in place that is responding on a daily basis to all inquiries that are coming in. So just a really quick description, just to make sure there's no confusion between disaster recovery and business continuity. Most of you probably know that DR, or disaster recovery, refers to an event that actually affects our infrastructure, like for example, a tornado or a hurricane that perhaps brings down a data center, and now people no longer have access to systems. In the COVID event, this is a business continuity event because the systems are up and running, but we need to make sure that people are still able to connect seamlessly, securely, and can continue to perform their job function. So a little bit about our Enterprise Resiliency Program. This was established a few years ago, and we've really found a lot of maturity over the past few years, and I'll walk you through that. So we have two goals at the highest level. We want to make sure that our company is prepared to cope with any major operational disruptions. And by doing so, we have crisis management plans in place that we review on a periodic basis and test via simulations to make sure that we are ready to respond quickly should a major incident disrupt our operations. We also are working to integrate resiliency into our DNA. And what that means is we want to emphasize and garner support across our workforce that everybody has a role here. Everybody should be familiar with what their department's business continuity plan is and be ready to execute it should the situation warrant. We have one common governance framework. So within that framework, we have 4 pillars. We have the business continuity, we have disaster recovery, our physical emergency response team. So this is in the case of, let's say an active shooter as an example, and then our enterprise crisis management program. So for those 4 pillars, we have a lead for each one of those functions with teams supporting it. And we all operate against one common framework. So we meet together on a regular basis, we plan our simulations, and we also identify where we have an opportunity to continue to scale as we continue to grow. In terms of ensuring we're prepared, we provide tools such as mobile-friendly resiliency action plans. That includes having crisis management plans available to us from our mobile devices. And we also conduct periodic exercises. So on an annual basis, we work with our business teams to simulate a scenario that we think potentially is at risk based on their location. So for example, in our Austin office, they are more at risk of a hurricane as an example, or somebody like Costa Rica is more at risk of a volcano. We actually simulate what the response would be should that incident happen. We also have site leaders for all of our sites. We have over 130 sites globally. We have a site leader that also owns a crisis management plan for that site, and we make sure that they are actively engaged in providing input to the crisis management plans and participating in simulations. We even do simulations with our executive staff. So for example, our CEO, Pat, and his team will actually put the time into on a couple times a year basis to participate in doing a simulation with us. So we really get top level support to make sure that we are resilient as a company. Luckily, in our particular case, we don't have to worry about supply chain, which obviously brings another level of complexity. But I just wanted to quickly spotlight that while supply chain is not a consideration, we still have to make sure from a business continuity, disaster recovery, that we've got the tools and processes and people ready to support that when needed. This just provides a high-level overview of how we went about rolling out our response specifically to COVID-19. So like I mentioned, we actually invoked our crisis management team back in January. This is before it was even identified as a pandemic. And this is before we even knew the scale of the impact on a global basis. So when the crisis management team was invoked, we reached out to the various stakeholders. We dusted off our pandemic crisis management plan. Never did I imagine that we would actually be putting that plan into place, but it provided us with a foundation to be able to assemble the team and replicate that around the globe. So currently we have about 30 sites that have a crisis management team replicated off the global framework. And so what we did is we quickly invoked those teams. They have their own meetings, discuss any scenario specific to their local jurisdiction requirements and so forth, but then it all rolls back up to our global crisis management team. So we have a very globally coordinated response, and we make sure we're all coordinated across the globe. Business continuity, I touched on. Again, we look to our VPs to own their business continuity plans. We provide the framework and the tools, and we help them schedule simulations, but they ultimately are the owners. One thing we do is we have people enroll their mobile number in an emergency notification tool. And right now we're at about 90–95%. It's not mandatory, but it's strongly encouraged. And the reason for that is in the case of a crisis that required immediate action, we can actually text them to advise them of the situation, if they have to shelter in place, or if we want to have them evacuate a certain building. From a technology resiliency, obviously we need to make sure that we're prepared if a data center goes down and we need to fail over. Again, this is not specific to COVID because our data center is up and running, but we still want to make sure that we exercise regular tests that we can fail over, fail back. We do that on a quarterly basis. We actually leverage VMware technology to do so. We have certain targets that we want to meet in terms of the timing it takes to fail over, fail back. We now have tertiary DR capabilities that we recently put into place. So now we can roll over from one data center to another, and if the second data center fails, we actually have a third. So we're really quite resilient in that way. And then from a people managers, we have a few thousand people managers at VMware globally, and our resiliency team also reaches out to people managers to make sure that there is understanding of what the business continuity plans are and helping people cope with the scenario. So we're really giving them the tools to be successful with responding to a crisis. So this is just a quick high-level summary of the key roles that are part of our global crisis management team. And again, like I mentioned, this is also replicated around the globe. So you will find even at our smaller sites, whether it's Seattle, for example, Austin, Costa Rica, that they've replicated this. Now, in some cases, some of the sites don't necessarily have, for example, like a legal person at their location, in which case we identify what legal person can cover that site. But we've got the chair, which is the executive decision maker. So he or she helps us remove any blockers, communicates with our executive team, and helps drive, timely decisions. The program management, which is where I step in and run the program. We've got legal in this particular example, HR, human resources, communications, which, like I mentioned earlier, is the backbone to making sure that this is very successful and people have regular insights to what's going on, what are the key decisions, what are the tips to work from home productively. We've got our real estate and workplace along with employee health and safety, which has been a vital component in the case of COVID, because we need to make sure that when we do start reopening the offices, we are including the tools and digital signage necessary to remind people of basic, important hygiene, keep your hands washed, you know, don't touch your face, wear a mask if you're in a common area, et cetera, et cetera. Events is a key component here because we have to make key decisions on if we need to start planning to virtualize an event versus having a physical presence. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, we announced that VMworld this year will be a virtual event. We've got a physical security, and in this particular case, and this is the first time we've done this, we have brought on a corporate medical advisor. So we're leveraging a consultant that has a doctor available to us to join in our calls. And he typically just joins in the first 10 minutes when we meet. And he just provides his insights because there's so much information out there and things are moving so quickly and they're discovering new information all the time. So this really helps provide a framework for us so we understand what the risks are. For example, the percentage of asymptomatic carriers, availability of testing, et cetera, that helps guide us as we're making decisions, especially as we're making decisions about how we are going to support returning to the office. One thing I want to quickly highlight is as part of the crisis management team, really nobody here is part of the crisis management team as a full-time job. They all have their day jobs, their specific areas that they're responsible for. But to be part of a crisis management team, what they need to do is when we onboard them, we make sure that one, they're familiar with our crisis management plan. Two, that they're familiar with all the other players that are part of the crisis management team. And then three, we actually request that they participate with us in a simulation, which could be 1 or 2 times a year, depending on what the site is, how frequently we want to do that. But again, when they are onboarded to the crisis management team, we provide the framework for them so they understand what the expectation is, who the key decision makers are, what our communication strategy is, and what the expectation is for their specific contribution to the team. And then we also, for the global crisis management team, we request that every main person has a backup person that can step in should the primary person not be available. So this provides a very, very strong framework. And in terms of responding to COVID, all the people identified here have been previously part of the crisis management team, with the exception of our corporate medical advisor that I mentioned, the external consultant who's a doctor. And in this particular case, we brought in our travel manager, who previously has not been involved in crisis management teams. But because travel is such an important consideration in terms of what are the controls we want to put into place. For example, now in China, domestic travel is starting to open up again. But we want to make sure that one, people understand they're not expected to travel. If a person is not comfortable yet, we want to reinforce that health and safety is our top priority. And if somebody doesn't feel like they're ready to travel for work yet, we want to support that. Secondly, we want to make sure we know what our processes are for making sure we've got contact tracing available. We do have guidelines that were established with input from our corporate medical advisor, our HR team, our legal team, in terms of how do we make sure that if somebody finds out that they have been tested positively or is exhibiting symptoms, that we can effectively trace. Now, we don't necessarily have a legal obligation to do that. But again, getting back to protecting the health and well-being of our workforce, we want to make sure that we are providing the space to them that they need in terms of social distancing if they do happen to have to be in the office or data center. And then when we start slowly phasing people back, we want to make sure that we continue that good practice of timely reporting, sanitization of a building if we need to, and contact tracing. So this is a very, very busy chart, but we put this into play a couple of months ago. It's an executive level view that we update every time we meet. Currently, our global crisis management team is meeting 3 times a week. When we first started this journey back in January, it was just once a week. This is before it was actually declared a pandemic and had such a global impact. Then we shifted to daily meetings, and now we're back on 3 times a week. But if I just quickly walk you through some of the highlights. So the first part here is fairly static. When we first started distributing this to our executive team and some of the key operational leaders, we just wanted to make sure they understood what the actual situation is. If we look at the key highlights, this is where we capture week to week or day to day. What are the key call outs that we want to do? Now, in this particular case, I'm showing you more of a templatized version and not the VMware specific content. But for example, for a travel policy, like I mentioned, we put some controls into play where we really wanted to either completely discontinue all travel or put some travel into play depending on where in the globe we thought it was safe to do so, but also make sure we had BP approval for any new travel request. For communications, I will go into a little bit more detail later in the deck, but we track on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis what are the various artifacts that we need to update. So for example, on VMware, we have our external newsroom. We typically update that once a week. Internally, we have a global CMT company-wide communication and a FAQ on our intranet site. We keep that refreshed. Again, this is a very fluid situation, and we need to make sure not only are we covering our global framework, but any regional specific details. We have further information under our FAQ for regional information as well. We have town halls led by our CEO, Pat. We've got an email alias where people can send a specific request, a concern to us that we respond to on average within 1 day. For special events, this is something that we are constantly monitoring to determine at what point should we make a decision to either cancel, postpone, or virtualize an event. So right now we have a rolling cadence. Like I said, we recently announced that VMworld would be virtualized, but going into the fall season and next year, we are still monitoring that those dates to make a decision on when we want to make that announcement, or we want to hold to the current date based on the situation at hand. For IT, this is always top of mind, of course, regardless of whether we're in a crisis situation or not. But given that we have, the majority of the workforce now, 97+% working remote, we are monitoring to make sure we're not hitting our thresholds, or if we are hitting our thresholds, we're adding, for example, new VPN gateways. So internally at VMware, we have a threshold of 40% of our capacity. So we actually have quite a bit of buffer there. But if and when we do hit 39–40%, our team will then put in new gateways to make sure that we were able to support and continue to monitor the concurrent users that are coming in inside our firewall. From an HR perspective, basically they have effectively virtualized our interviews, new hires training, orientations, etc. We also put into play, like I mentioned earlier, how we would support our contact tracing. And we also capture on a daily, weekly basis the actual number of VMware employees that either have been positively confirmed or potentially suspected as having COVID-19. And then we do touch base as well for those that have been positively confirmed. And luckily it's a relatively small number, but we do check in to see how they're doing, and we report that out to our executive team as well. For facilities, again, we have a lot to do to prepare for returning to the office. And I specifically call it return to office as opposed to return to work, because the reality is people are working from home, and we're finding from a productivity standpoint that things are going extremely well. We show up in the right-hand corner some of the operational risks around service delivery, program delivery, etc. And week to week, we have an executive dashboard where we're tracking the volume, for example, of inbound service requests, how quickly we're responding to those, escalations, backlog. And we have definitely had a couple hiccups here, especially where we might have needed like physical labor, for example. We're putting in a community microgrid. So that required construction. So that project has been shifted out. But other than that, I would say 95% of our projects, our productivity is really tracking as if though it was just business as usual. So it has been a truly amazing, seamless transition to the work from home mode. And then the last thing I'll just mention here is we rely on the Johns Hopkins dashboard. This is from a couple of months ago. I think most people are aware the number is now over 2 million, but we just help track day to day, you know, what the trend looks like. And we include that in our report. Getting into our communications. So we included a slide here because again, the communications framework is such a vital piece to make sure that our employees understand that we are actively monitoring, responding, and preparing for the return to office scenario. So it took a couple weeks to figure out what would be the right framework. We didn't want to over communicate, but we tended to err more on over communication than under communication. It's been very well received. About a week or two ago, we actually did a quick poll of our employee sentiment after an all hands meeting, and it was either 95 or 90%, 96% of our employees said that they felt that VMware was really providing, you know, the most current information, and that we really cared for their safety and well-being. So it was very, very positive sentiment. So to quickly go through our communications, we have VP forums. So we have a few hundred VPs. We offer this twice a day on about every 2 weeks basis. It's led by Pat, our CEO. And this brings the VPs together, just 30 minutes, but we just provide them with a snapshot of what's going on, what are the areas that may, you know, be of concern, where we need them to lean in, what's the messaging back to their teams. We've also had our corporate medical advisor attend to provide his perspective on the current situation and the direction we're heading. We've got a weekly global CMT communication. And again, it's very similar. We keep it fairly high level, but we just want to continue to provide the latest information as to what's going on. We also provide tips on how to work effectively from home, tips on what types of things are eligible for reimbursement. You know, we've had a few requests to get set up at the office. And so we have some guidelines on how that works. We do have an intranet site, and this is where we post our FAQs that we keep refreshed on a regular basis. Sometimes it's refreshed daily, depending on what's going on. Last week, we had over 80,000 hits of our intranet site. So clearly people are really finding it very informative, and they're leveraging that. We've got regional CMT communication. So for example, India has over 7,000 people in the country of India. They have a CMT, and they meet typically twice a week to look at any specific concerns and things that they have to put into play specific to India. As I mentioned earlier, some countries had very, very little advance notice about the shift to work from home. In India's case, they literally were told, you know, like hours in advance that the whole country was being locked down. That did create some challenges for us initially because people didn't even have the opportunity to go back in the office and get monitors, as an example. In the US, at Palo Alto, as an example, we were allowed access back to the building to bring home ergonomic chairs, monitors, et cetera. But we couldn't support that based on local, you know, jurisdiction requirements around the globe. All hands meetings, again, we have done a few of these led by Pat, and were very well attended, very well received. We have very specific communications that go out occasionally from whether it's HR facilities, For example, we recently announced a pandemic leave policy, so that was very well received, and HR sent out that communication. And as I mentioned earlier as well, we have a very comprehensive plan for how we do contact tracing at VMware, what the guidelines are, and we make sure that we track that and we'll report that back to the global CMT so we can continue to monitor the risk profile of our workforce. So here is a snapshot of yesterday and today. So from a work style, some of you could relate to these various categorizations: desk-centric, the corridor warrior, remote worker, on-the-go pro, or intensive user. And today, basically everybody is remote. So that's the current state. That's the new norm. So I wanted to quickly provide some additional program resources that will be included in this webinar recording. Encourage you to take a look and get some additional information. And then I want to pause to take any questions that may be coming in. Okay, let's see. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to provide the questions. Okay, there's a question about how we actually test our business continuity. So what we do is we identify, I touched on this briefly earlier, but we identify for a given site what the biggest threat or threats are, and then we build a script where we walk through a particular scenario. We have done various simulations. We had never actually done a pandemic simulation, interestingly enough. But we've done simulations on an earthquake in the Palo Alto campus, a volcano in Costa Rica, a hurricane in Austin. And so what we've done is we have scripted this to say, let's just hypothetically play this out, that this is an event that either is about to happen, or there's a forewarning, or is actively happening. How would we respond? We use our emergency tool to send out an alert to our crisis management team at the local site, and they assemble. What we do is we actually have a war room that we can put into play to actually have like a physical response if the building is still available for people to convene. Depending on the scenario, it might be a virtual war room or it might be a physical war room. But in the physical war room, we have binders in case there's any issues with the system, where people can actually go through our crisis management plans and make sure that the response is well documented. And of course, every scenario can be a little bit unique. Even our crisis management plan for the pandemic, we've learned a lot along the way, and we're making real-time updates to that. But what we do is when we simulate, we actually invoke the local crisis management team, and we bring them together either virtually or mostly for simulations in the physical war room, and we role play. Well, what do we know about the situation? What's the current risk? What is our response? How quickly we want to get a communication out? What's the next update? Do we want to keep the the conference call, the bridge up and running as we're playing it out? And so typically it can run an hour to 4 hours, depending on the nature of the simulation. We close that out and then we do post-mortem. And I have to say, every single time we've done a simulation, we have found lessons learned. There's nothing like even practicing to get better, to be more prepared for responding to a scenario at hand. And like I mentioned earlier, our executive team has been very engaged, very responsive, in helping us with those simulations as well by actively participating, whether it's cyber attack, a physical threat, etc. So I would definitely encourage everyone to take a look at their internal business continuity plans, crisis management plans, and be able to just, you know, the real benefit of that is people just know how to come together, what the expectation is, who the members of the team are, and how to collaborate, and how to drive to quick decisions and communications to make sure that everybody is aware, especially the executive team, on the nature of the threat, the current known impacts, and the, you know, suggested next steps. Okay, so I think that basically brings us to the end of the session. I just wanted to quickly highlight there are some upcoming customer webinars. So please take a look and register if there's any topics of interest. And I just wanted to conclude by thanking you for your time, and be well.
Thank you everyone for joining our VMware on VMware webinar. The recording will be sent out tomorrow. Be safe and have a great day. Bye-bye.